Why are you just becoming a teacher? Was a commonly asked question that was asked of me while I was a Northwestern student, especially from the likes of those going into business or finance or a field where folks made a guapalop of money. And by the way, guapalop means anything in excess. Despite the microaggressions I face with regards to that question, in addition to being commonly mistaken for an athlete because I was a black man on campus, I wish I had the response for them that I had now. Number one, teaching is a privilege. And number two, I have the distinct responsibility of empowering our future and humanizing one another. What's your superpower? Okay? My name is Corey Winchester. I am black, I'm queer, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a friend. I'm a first-generation college graduate. I experienced oppression, and I experienced privilege. But above all, I am a radical educator. For the purposes of our time together, we're going to be talking about how we can reclaim our collective humanity if we are supporting public educators and by supporting the educators who are looking to improve the tangible and intangible conditions of our students, especially ones who hold marginalized identities in our world. We can do this by centering one another in love. That's teaching radically. Welcome to my classroom. It's the most expensive classroom I've ever been in. But today, our objective is this. It's our last period class, too. To interrogate, reflect, and challenge one another to see and know what radical teaching looks like in our world. Calling myself a radical educator is not meant to be profound or having anything to do with an achieved level of wokeness. And by the way, that's a badge that we should probably retire. Today, we'll define radical as anything relating to the fundamental nature of something, far-reaching or thorough. That's all I seek to be as an educator. And it's not what I do that is particularly radical, but how I do it and why I do it that is. So let's start with the why. First, teaching is political. Nothing that we do in our world is absent of a political context. And even our perception of political neutrality is inherently a political statement. And likewise, teaching is too, because we exist in a political world. So let me paint a picture of the world in which I teach in, okay? We exist in a world where anti-blackness threatens black existence, one where capitalism exploits the have-nots, one where homophobia threatens queer existence, one where transphobia denies individuals the ability to find truth in the bodies in which they occupy, one where patriarchy devalues women and elevates men, right? One where toxic masculinity contributes to rigid gendered experiences and misogyny. One where white supremacy claims ownership of not only land and capital, but of people, access, and ideas. We're even struggling right now, our world is struggling to maintain homeostasis. Is this what our humanity is? Because if it is, it needs something radically different, like what educators have the opportunity and the access to do if they're supported. Because this picture that I just painted scares the hell out of me, and it should scare the hell out of you too. Loving radically is the antithesis of all the things mentioned above. It can lead to revolutionary acts. So how do we ensure the future of our young people, of our youth? Grace Lee Boggs, whose last major publication, The Next American Revolution, Sustainable Activism in the 21st Century, came at the tender age of 95 years old. Lethal Weapon actor Danny Glover once sat down and had a conversation with Grace, and they were talking about education, and he basically said, hey, Grace, I think education is meant to prepare students for work defined by technological advancements in capitalism. If you know anything about Grace Lee Boggs, she said, no, it's not. And then said, that's exactly what young people are rejecting. Then she said, what is education for? And it's the same question that we need to be asking of our society and of ourselves. But the reality is that in the United States, we've been wrestling with this question for generations. So I'm a history teacher. Let me give a little bit of a history lesson, okay? When Horace Mann proposed the idea for common schools, he argued that this free, universal, non-sectarian, and public institution was the best means of achieving the moral and socioeconomic uplift of all Americans. History would show that that reality is far from the truth. When you apply an industrial model to teaching, people become commodities. Exploitative systems centering supremacy meant folks that looked like me, black and brown people, folks who did not present as men, and those who did not have the financial means would be rendered invisible in the system. Immigrant children were forced to leave their ethnicities at the door as they entered public schools. Native Americans were forced into assimilation, leading to cultural genocide. Jim Crow segregation ran rampant in the South, culminating in some landmark Supreme Court cases, from Mendez versus Westminster in 1947 to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. People sought to challenge the status quo, but due to privatization of public schools, criminalization and divestment in black and brown communities, amidst a host of many other examples of oppression, we are still struggling to define what education is, right? And what is seen as a great equalizer often replicates supremacy in our world. So I think this goes back to that question of truly, what is education for, right? It needs something radically different. And this is a question that Grace challenges and asks us, right? What is seen as the means of social reproduction must now serve as a means of social disruption. And this is why I feel like my work is radical as an educator, because it's trying to effectuate change to that very scary picture that I just painted previously. I do believe that education has the ability to change our world, but it's going to take the collective we, all the educators in this space, to do that. We are the leaders in this work. And echoing Boggs, we are the leaders we seek. And so we come back to this question about how can we be radical? We have to find our radical nature through love. I first learned about love in the context of education through another TED experience, through Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, who in his TED Talk referenced the late Dr. Maya Angelou. In 2011, Maya Angelou had the chance to sit down with Oprah Winfrey and give her master lesson, during which she talked about love. She talked about the love that her mother had for her and the love that her mother expressed for Maya, right? She said this is a love of liberation. It does not bind. In other words, love is not something that is owned or possessed. Rather, it is a liberating expression, right? That level of love is the same thing that I seek to offer to my students and is what I believe can lead to revolutionary acts, okay? My love starts at the beginning of the school year. Before we hop into content, before we do any of the things that teachers are typically told that they need to do. I spend the first full week getting to know my students, and my students get to know me. They ask me questions about who I am. I talk about my life story, how I grew up in West Philadelphia, born and raised, in the books where I spent most of my days. I talk about who I am. I talk about my family, right? And kids will start asking me questions about my lived experience, about who I am. And they'll realize that I'm not a person that sleeps under my desk at night, right? They see me as a human being, one who has complex identities. You know, I get questions asking me about, well, what my coming out story was like. And then sometimes I get questions from students who ask me if Northwestern was a party school. But at the end of the day, I think what's important is that they see me as a human being, right? And in that same vein, I try to extend that same space for students. I ask them who they are, ask them about why they're here, ask them about what they hope to gain in my classroom. What is it that they want to learn about themselves, right? Then I also give them a chance to actually have that conversation with each other. Oftentimes, and this is very, very true of my high school students, they'll sit in a classroom with the same students for the entire year, right next to each other, and not know the name of the person next to them. That's not seeing one person's humanity, right? So by the end of that first week, every student has a conversation with each other. And that's not something that's typically profound. They're not going to walk away from this experience being best friends, but at the end of the day, you're going to know the person that sits next to them. Because relationship trust is the basis of the work that I do. All of these things let my students know that they're seen, right? It goes back to the Zulu greeting of Sawubona, meaning I see you. It goes back to the South African principle of Ubuntu. You are because I am because you are. It goes back to the Mayan principle of En Lakesh, tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. If I harm you, I harm myself. None of these principles or proverbs are mine to claim, but as teachers, we're really great borrowers. And I've synthesized information over the years that has not only allowed me to see my own humanity, but have allowed me to see the humanity of others, right? Experiences that I've had from friends, family, colleagues, students, and strangers that my 30 years have left an impression on me, okay? There's not a test in the world that can measure what I do. Not an evaluation system, not a law, not a policy, not No Child Left Behind, not Race to the Top, nothing. But what does are stories, experiences from my students that they've shared from their own lived experience, okay? They're talking about how they've learned about themselves, right? About their own humanity, this notion of self-love. One of the big principles and mantras in my room is no history, no self. And without that critical examination of who you are, this work becomes really hard and really difficult. But I want to share experiences and letters from a couple of students that I've gotten over the years that have spoken to this. One student said, "You gave me this incredible gift of consciousness, and I truly would not be the same person without that. I want to be that kind of teacher that makes kids feel that they can make a difference, that they matter to this world. I know that we are all on this journey for self-love. I know that this is the hardest thing to accomplish in today's world. But I want to say that I have no doubt in my mind that you will get there. You deserve to get the love you so fearlessly give to your students and to everyone in your life." The second letter, the student said this: "Thank you for teaching me to be critical. Thank you for empowering me with education. Thank you for creating a space for me to embrace my identities and become a justice-oriented individual. You taught me about race, about equity, oppressive systems, and the history of resistance. As I continue my journey to become an educator, I constantly think of you and what you've done for me. I'll also never forget you being one of the first people I told about being undocumented. You hugged me, affirmed me, and helped me believe that I could still achieve my dreams. Thank you for gracing my life. I wish you luck in everything." Ironically enough, both of these students are in school right now to become high school history teachers, right? It's really humbling to know that you can have that impact. I think at the end of the day, my effectiveness as a teacher has little to do with how much history I know, although that helps, okay? Whether or not I give the most homework, which typically I do. Whether or not my tests are really hard, which in most cases they are. But that's not where my work comes from, right? It comes from these experiences with our students, right? Because they realize at the end of the day that I see them as a complex individual, as a person, as a human who deserves love. And I learned this because I had to learn how to love myself. Not only have I had the opportunity to do work in my classrooms, I'm also the staff coordinator for a student organization called SOAR, or Students Organized Against Racism. SOAR started at ETHS in 2012 as part of our district equity transformation plan. Not knowing what SOAR would become, I worked with a group of colleagues in creating a space that eventually became an institution at ETHS, one that centered youth voices, their intersectional identities, and empowered them to look for ways to disrupt racism and white supremacy in our school, all while developing critical leadership. Ronald Heifetz, who's an expert in leadership studies, summarizes what I think the SOAR space to be, one at best where leadership is a labor of love. At ETHS, SOAR is most known for hosting its SOAR conferences, during which the Student Leadership Board facilitates over the course of 2 days experiences that provide tools for personal reflection and engagement in looking at how racism and white supremacy can be disrupted. Students look towards their actions, their ideology, and try to examine how they can change and work to disrupt racism in their personal walks of life. At ETHS, SOAR isn't really about being in a club, but it's more so a way of engagement and being. One of the other areas that SOAR has been really transformational is in disrupting long-standing traditions. And one example of this was the cotillion dance that was recently ended in the Evanston community. It's been going on for decades, but students found that cotillion was a space that was racist, transphobic, exclusive, amongst other things, and they worked to dismantle that. And for those looking to replicate the work that I do, I've come up with something simple called the DIY approach. There's 3 steps, okay? Step 1 is decentering adultism. When adults step aside, youth have a space where they can learn how to develop their own personal agency, and they'll act, because we started to elevate and rehumanize their voices. Step 2 is inculcating a culture of critical reflection. As students examine different systems and look at power, privilege, hegemony, and domination, right, personally and institutionally, they'll start to recognize and see how they exist in relation to others, about and across difference. And step 3, youth act. Now that they have a space, they'll realize that they need to take all of these tools and work to disrupt many of these spaces. And they'll start acting, okay? Students are organizing boycotts, walkouts, they're mentoring students younger and older than they're working with adults. But at the end of the day, I'm realizing that they're reading more, that they're learning more, that they're reflecting more, and that they're loving more. I learned to love from folks around me. My family, the OGs, taught me what unconditional love looks like. That's my first grade teacher, if we're going from left to right, Miss Gray. She taught me how to love teaching. She taught me how to love learning. She taught me how to love failure. John Dugan, Onyampun, and Jesus Carrasco all taught me what radical love looks like for myself. And these are some of the same things that I think we all need to think about. We can do this. We have educators all around us. Why don't you look to the left, say, hey, you're an educator. Y'all look to the left and say, hey, you're an educator. Okay? And then look to the right and say, I got you. I'm about to teach you. I love you. There we go. We need to see one another, okay? And so, in closing, I go back to that question that Grace asked Jimmy, or Grace asked Danny Glover. Jimmy was her husband. So what is education for? To me, it's about 3 things. It's about relationships, love, and disruption. The first thing we need to realize is that relationships matter. Take the time, regardless of what profession you're in, regardless of what space you're in, take the time to connect and build those relationships with the folks around you. Take the time to see the humanity in the people with whom you engage. But more importantly, you have to take the time to see and know and love yourself, right? We all have work to do in this. But at the end of the day, we have to realize that relationships matter. The second thing is that we have to support our educators, right? And unlike those students who asked me why I was becoming a teacher, we matter. Support public education, support our unions, support policies that work to humanize our students and the folks who exist in those spaces working with students. That's crucial in this work. The last is to take the time to love. RuPaul, if y'all don't know, one of his favorite taglines is, if you don't love yourself, how in the hell are you going to love somebody else? Amen. There we go. Take the time to learn, to love who you are. But more importantly, take the time to learn and love the folks around you. Okay? That is a radical act. Thank you.